We're taking this, 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 we're taking with a pinch of salt.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of A Pinch of Salt, a podcast series by ERA, the place where we try to give you sensible answers to clinically relevant questions. It is a privilege to have with us today Dr. Andreas Kronbichler. Andreas is a colleague of ours from Austria, currently working at the University Hospital in Innsbruck. He's a very prolific researcher. If you check him out on PubMed, which is what people do often, you'll get a whole number of papers attached to his name. Very impressive feat, especially if we consider his young age. I hope he doesn't mind me calling him young. I mean, young is a relative thing. In rock and roll terms, he's probably not young anymore, but in nephrology terms, for sure. He's also this year's winner of the Eberhard Ritz Award for Young Investigators in Clinical Science and is currently the chair of the Immunophrology Working Group for the ERA. So he's done quite a lot of stuff, and we're very happy to have him here today so we might pick his brain, figure out what his secret is, or at least some good suggestions about research, because we learn clinical medicine in school. We don't learn that much research. So this is a daunting task for most of us. Andreas, thank you for being here and welcome to A Pinch of Salt.
Well, thank you, Andre. I mean, we know each other since a couple of years very well, and it's my great privilege to be here and be on the podcast. I also do agree with you that, age is just a number, and it's definitely not, a qualifying thing if you're older, I think. So this is really something I want to convey to all the younger colleagues, that this is really just a number.
Yeah. If you're young, it doesn't mean that you can't do cool stuff, for sure. So if we're okay, we might just go to the first question. So the first question is obviously on research, which is what we'll be talking about today. And for colleagues who are part of large medical institutions with a long history of doing research, it seems relatively easy to start a research career. Basically, your boss tells you what to do and gets the money for the project. But how about for those that are not part of such a group, which is probably most of us, I guess? What would your advice be on how to get a research career started if you're not a part of a well-established research group?
So this is, of course, a very important question I always get or often get from others and other colleagues. I think this is really not easy to answer. In my personal case, I returned to Innsbruck after being almost a year in Germany to start my training. And I wanted to do research in autoimmune kidney diseases. So my boss said, nobody's doing it here, so you can start. So basically with 26, I then started to do my research in autoimmune kidney diseases. And soon thereafter, of course, publications and, actually people you really think, making a difference in the field. And it's then good to not only discuss critical patient cases with these people, and these people are usually very helpful and respond to your messages, and then also get in touch during different conferences. And so I think this is a really good way to start, basically as a one-man show, your own so-called research group. When it comes to funding, this is of course a major issue. And I can tell all the colleagues here listening to the podcast that getting funding, especially in smaller countries without having an established name, is a real nightmare. You need to be really persistent. And I will offer most of you basically to read through applications, although I have not been successful that often myself. But I think this is very important that you have another pair of eyes basically looking over your application and figure out if this is something, fundable, if international reviewers are reading it. So this is definitely something I would offer because that's a very important part of starting a research group. Then it's of course you need to decide in which direction you're going. For me, it was always clear I'm a 100% clinician. I'm seeing a lot of patients. I'm seeing my autoimmune patients and also my transplant patients and so on and so forth. So out of curiosity, you sometimes actually create ideas for your research, and then you need to pursue this idea. If you, as myself, work in a smaller university hospital, you don't have this massive amount of patients, these cohorts, where you can really say, okay, I'm publishing it as a single center cohort. But with an idea, you just can approach basically experts in your field. And I've learned that many of them are very interested in collaborations. And this is, of course, something where you can really learn and work together. And those people working in the field of rare kidney diseases are usually very collaborative.
Yeah, I guess we're often quite apprehensive to contact somebody who's an established name, but my experience is similar to yours that usually they're quite approachable. And you need to be willing to embarrass yourself a bit. That always works in life.
Yeah, I mean, Andre, this is, of course, something what you can expect is basically you get no response, and that's the worst outcome you can have. But then you rewrite your email, and if there is still no response, then you know that there is no interest to help, and B, that there is probably not a good basis for collaboration. And I think this is, of course, something you need to figure out, but this is experience all of us made. But in 80-90% of the cases, you will at least get some kind of feedback. And then I guess 40-50%, if they are convinced by your idea, will help you and also will help to shape the project moving ahead. So this is really something people should pursue.
Yeah, I really like the fact that you mentioned that you're a clinician first, and I actually do believe that's the right way to start a medical career. I think it's a bit counterproductive to be burdened by research too early on because good clinical research answers clinically relevant questions and you only get to realize what those are if you work in a clinical setting. So maybe one advice to younger colleagues would be to not be too burdened by having a research career very early on, just so that you get your clinical feet going, I guess. Would you agree with that?
Sure, I think, I didn't finish my message beforehand. I just noticed because I think, if you're going more towards basic science or translational science, it's of course important to start that early on, but then you also need to be, let's say, born into a research group because you need to have substantial funding for that. And then you will create this basic science brain where you can just continue with all these, research topics, which are also relevant. But here it's a different story because you need to have substantial funding. And in this case, I think, you can start your PhD or whatsoever after your medical degree and then pursue your clinical career. But in case, as a clinician or clinical research, I think ideas are born along your way seeing patients, and that's definitely some kind of difference. And so I agree with you, Andre.
Yeah. You mentioned that you tried to apply for some research funds for some funding. Where can one find these calls? Where would you look for them? To just to give some simple pointers of where to search for them, or where's a good place to search for these kind of calls?
See, well, I've worked in the UK where you have, of course, more opportunities. So you have basically private charities, but you also have national funding agencies. And these private charities are often very helpful because they would offer, of course, a limited amount of money, but money which is good enough, so to say, to really, focus on some smaller projects. And sometimes this is up to 300, 500,000 pounds, which is really substantial, and you can do a lot of stuff with that. So these charities are very helpful. Also, sometimes the calls are more focused on things you really want to do. While when I'm looking now into Austria, we have one major funding source. It's a national funding source. And here you can, for instance, submit a standalone project, and then you compete with all others. So not only, all the medics, not only the whole basic scientists, but also people, for instance, working in business.
Mm.
And this becomes, of course, much more difficult because here you're bumping sometimes into reviews which you don't really understand. And sometimes you just have issues, to understand why you didn't get the funding. And so this is, of course, much more complicated. And dealing with this, one single funding agency is often complicated. Plus, if you're lucky and you receive funding, you're restricted to actually three funds at one time. So if you have long-term, basically research funding, it's becoming an issue. Then, of course, you have the European funding sources, and they are quite helpful because you can ask for a lot of money. But of course, again, as a clinician, it's very difficult to find the time for that because it requires a lot of time. You need to get the budget right, and you need to find, of course, research partners willing to contribute to your project. So you will need to come up with some ideas and, of course, also data to convince others to contribute to your project. Another option is, of course, if you do, let's say, rare disease research, there are also European funding calls where they want to see specifically projects in rare diseases, and that is helpful. So ideally, you will find a funding call which really focuses on your research topic, and then you can tailor your proposal basically to what's needed there. So there are a couple of avenues. I know that in smaller countries, it's much more difficult, I think, than in larger countries to get funding, especially in nephrology.
Yeah, that was some very good, very helpful advice, I believe. I remember a lady colleague that I met in Germany when I was there, who I think was quite successful with applications. At least that's the way it seemed to me. And she told me, you know what, you need to contact the people who have created the call and ask them, what exactly do you expect me to write here? And I said, is that kind of legal, And she said, well, they're creating the call. They're expecting something. There's nothing wrong with asking them, what exactly do you expect me to provide here? And I never thought about that. Have you ever contacted the people who created the call to kind of get some almost insider information what they want to get?
Well, I think this is very helpful if you have basically some smaller organizations with a very specific call. If they would be, willing to fund whatever you're proposing, I think this is important. But as I mentioned, if you have one funding agency, they have a standard form for all their proposals, so 20 pages,
Mm.
10 different sections, and then you really can't really ask them what you should write there because it's obvious what you should write. But if it's a smaller call, especially from a charity, and they fund something on immunocompetence and you are unclear, for instance, if that falls into the area of expertise, what they want to see, then I think it's really good to contact them ahead of that. But I wouldn't really ask what they really want specifically from your research that goes into there.
Yeah, good. That's good. Um, so research is a craft. It's something you learn. It's got its own rules and things that work and don't work. So it's probably sensible to start research by doing something more simple, I guess. To like learning any craft, you start off by doing something simple. So what would you suggest to be like the an initial or beginning research project for one of our younger colleagues? I assume that most of us start off with a kind of retrospective cohort study. I remember there's an eminent professor in Slovenia who's a world leading expert in borreliosis, and he did all of his research by just systematically um, getting all of his data from all of our borreliosis patients. He always told me clinical research is nothing else than systematically amassing your data of the stuff you do every day. So is that how one should start off, or how did you start off with research?
So, well, I think I'm still a fan. So my boss told me after I said, okay, I want to do autoimmune kidney diseases, he said, start off with a review. And I can remember, I spent too much time basically reading all the publications in this field and then summarize that. But the impression I got basically from reading all this literature is that there are a lot of unmet needs. And then what we did afterwards was to focus on systematically putting together all the patients receiving rituximab for podocytopathies. And so I contacted different people, among them one of my mentors, Annette Bruchfeld, who have become very much like friends, but also basically great collaborators over time. And we put that together. And then, of course, if you have no name in the field, it gets really hard to get it published. So you also need to learn to live with rejections. This is another thing which comes a bit in the beginning as, of course, more or less a personal rejection, but it is not the case basically, because editors want to see a name in the field, of course, being part of the author team to get citations. And this is something you need to understand and you need to learn. And so we got plenty of rejections on that. And it was finally published in the American Journal of Nephrology, which was by the time really not a great journal. I would say it's better now. But at least, and this is also important, it got plenty of citations. So I was pretty happy after a couple of years to see that other people also thought that this idea is not that bad. And what we did basically then, that was 2017, 2018, together with my great colleague Philip Gaukler, to establish the return registry. And we have just published actually our first paper out of that in JSON a couple of days ago. So this is very important, and it's really like, say, sensation seeking, which brings you forward. And whether this is a retrospective analysis, whether you're employing nowadays more modern techniques, and this is of course something when you're interested in statistical approaches, for instance, target trial emulation is something which is very popular and which will also become much more widely used in the field of autoimmune kidney diseases soon. Then of course you have a good foundation for your research. And I think this is very, very important to think about. Is my question I'm trying to ask important? Yes, no. Is it novel? Yes, no. And what kind of journals would be interested to publish that? This is always something you need to ask yourself in the beginning.
Yeah, you just mentioned the whole other part of research, which is, so the first part is creating the research itself, getting the data and doing the statistical analysis, and then it's the publishing part, which can be the frustrating one. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the best practical way about, learning about the business of publishing? Because it's a bit of a business, right? It's a bit of a thing. So, it's a craft like any other, like we said, for research in general. So would you suggest to people to become a regular reviewer of papers or part of an editorial board? That seems like, you need to be close to these things to figure out how they work. What would you suggest people do? Is it easy to become a part of an editorial board? Is it something worth doing?
Well, listen, this is, of course, a brilliant question, I would say. I had basically created a list of journals I've been reviewer for from the beginning onwards. And I initially accepted really a lot of out of the scope papers, even on thrombosis, for instance,
Mhm.
for hematology journals. So I reviewed, I guess, for 80 plus journals in my life, which is really, I think, it was a massive undertaking. Now I don't have the time, unfortunately, for that. So I'm basically just reviewing for nephrology and rheumatology journals and bigger internal medicine journals. And that's enough. And I'm not taking on too many roles. So I would suggest in the beginning, of course, review for journals you like, for instance, like our European journals. I usually try to accept these invitations if possible. And then, of course, sometimes also review a bit outside your research focus, because reviewing is a very important part to create new ideas, also
Mm.
for your research, but also basically to see what is going on in the field of nephrology or medicine or rheumatology, for instance. So this is definitely an advice I would give to everyone. When it comes to editorial board, this is something where you need to advance in your career to get asked to be part of editorial board of bigger journals. So it's also important to mention that most of the nephrology journals now have an editorial fellowship, which means you're applying for that. And if you're selected, you get an experienced associate editor who takes care of you. That
Mm.
means that you're handling this manuscript together with an experienced associate editor. You are selecting the reviewers for them, and you are also doing the first assessment, and then discuss that with the associate editor if you agree on a decision. And then these manuscripts are usually also discussed in a larger group, and you can benefit from that immensely. So I think like Jason, KI, American Journal of Kidney Disease, and NDD, for instance, do have these initiatives, and they are really worthwhile pursuing. They're very popular, so it's also competitive, but it's important to start applying. And what I want to also convey is that if you're not selected the first time, you should just retry. Don't give up, never give up. I tried, for instance, to get into the immunonephrology working group of ERA, I don't know, 2 years in a row, and it didn't work out. And so the third application was finally positive. So importantly, just keep on trying. That's very important.
Yeah, for sure. Persistence is the key to any kind of success. And yeah, these editorial fellowships really sound great. And if you don't get one, keep on trying, like you said. And the good thing about reviewing is that you learn from the mistakes of others, right? You can clearly see the things that weren't good from other papers, and you can then try to avoid them. Because if you don't think about these things, you'll end up doing the same kind of mistakes for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and one important thing is also that, if you start reviewing paper from an editor's perspective, it's not only the quality of paper, it's sometimes, of course, would you consider that this is a very important research topic? So I sometimes have manuscripts which I don't like that much, and I say to the editor, I would basically reject it, but I think that this is cited quite often. And then I just see that most of the editors are then deciding to go for a major revision, for instance. So this is also very important to see basically both perspective if you're reviewing a paper.
Sure, because publishing is a trade and it has its own trade rules. And if you're aware of that, you can be much more successful.
Yeah.
Great, great. I think you provided some very, very good information for all of us who aren't really into research all that much and might want to be. So we're just, getting to the last question, which is usually the most difficult one, which is the getting to know you question. Um, so I know you like to ski. You're from Austria. I guess everybody from Austria likes to ski. Skiing is great. But the standardized question that we have is related to music and books and luxury items. So we're asking everybody which two songs and which book would one take to a desert island, and which luxury item as well. So let's have it.
Yeah, you're very cool here. I know that. So I, of course, try to prepare, but actually my preparation is usually to be unprepared for that. So, well,
That's fine. That's fine.
my music taste has evolved, so to say, from being a really big hip hop fan. So I would go back and say, okay, if I can choose, I would probably pick one of the songs of Enter the Wu-Tang Clan, which was,
Oh, That's a fabulous record.
A 1994 album I really loved. And now that I'm, of course, having a bit of a national pride, I would also say if you move on to a bit classical music, I would say the Blue Danube from Strauss Jr. would be probably the one I would also take with me because it's long, so it's not really getting boring. And it's just a masterpiece, I think, of classical music.
Absolutely. Great choice.
And luxury item, I really don't need much. I would probably take my laptop because you can do a lot, especially if, there is some kind of internet connection or so.
Very rational, very rational. And then the book. What,
Yeah, I thought about
what's your
that
favorite book or,
because I'm not reading that much. But you gave a very good recommendation recently. But I would then say probably I would take a longer book, which is then The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer, which has been really a great book, I think. And from a perspective of a medic, but written for non-medics, I think I find that very impressive.
Wow, that's interesting. I
That
have to
one.
look that up. Great. Okay, Andreas. So thank you very much for joining us. And I guess you're a big name now. So if people want to contact you, you might be approachable as well as one of the big names. Will you be one of the 50% that answers, or one of the 50 that doesn't have the time to do so?
The problem is that I'm too curious, Andre. So I really like to collaborate and I like to write protocols, projects, reviews, whatever. Everybody is welcome to contact me and I try to take my time to answer, of course.
Great, great. Thank you very much for everything you're doing, and thank you for joining us in A Pinch of Salt.